series of messages from the Gospel of Mark. We're going to be looking today at a very familiar account about the night that Jesus calmed the storm. If you would, turn with me to the Gospel of Mark, chapter 4. Mark chapter 4, and let's read verses 35 through 41. On the same day, when evening had come, he said to them, "Let us cross over to the other side." Now when they had left the multitude, they took him along in the boat as he was, and other little boats were also with him. And a great windstorm arose, and the waves beat into the boat so that it was already filling. But he was in the stern, asleep on a pillow. And they awoke him and said to him, "Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing?" Then he arose and rebuked the wind, and said to the sea, "Peace, be still." And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. But he said to them, "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" And they feared exceedingly and said to one another, "Who can this be, that even the wind and the sea obey him?" As we look closer at this passage, there are three thoughts that I would like to share with you this morning. First of all, I would have you to notice the suddenness of the storm. Look again at verses 35 through the first part of verse 37. On the same day when the evening had come, he said to them, "Let us cross over to the other side." Now when they had left the multitude, they took him along in the boat as he was, and other little boats were also with him, and a great windstorm arose. This has been a very long day for Jesus. We learned in the first couple of verses of this fourth chapter of Mark's Gospel that Jesus spent the entire day in a boat teaching the great multitudes that had gathered along the shores of the Sea of Galilee. He taught them these parables that we have been looking at in these recent weeks. And so late in the day, when the crowd started to break up and head home, Jesus said to his disciples, "Let us cross over to the other side," meaning the other side of the Sea of Galilee. Now the Sea of Galilee is only 8 miles wide by 13 miles long. And so we're talking about a journey of no more than 8 miles. The Sea of Galilee is a very unique body of water. Normally when we think of a sea, we think of salt water. But the Sea of Galilee is actually a freshwater body, more like a lake. In fact, the Sea of Galilee is also known as Lake Gennesaret or Lake Tiberias. And at 682 feet below sea level, it is the lowest freshwater lake on the earth. Now, let me explain a little bit about the topography around the Sea of Galilee to set the stage for what happened that night. The Sea of Galilee is surrounded by mountains on all sides that form a bowl shape around the sea. And because of that bowl shape, the sea is subject to very severe winds. In the summertime, the warm Sirocco winds blow in from the east. These Sirocco winds are a lot like the Santa Ana winds that blow in California. And typically, these strong winds blew each day from around noon to about 6 o'clock in the evening. And so they were pretty predictable. And often these winds would reach gale force. They would churn up the sea with waves 10 to 20 feet high, which was extremely unusual for a freshwater lake. In other words, it could be calm 1 minute, And within 5 minutes, a violent storm could blow up on the sea. That was true in Jesus' day, and it is still true today. I've been there, and I've seen this happen with my very own eyes. So I know that this is how things are. This is the climate around the sea. And typically when these storms blow up on the Sea of Galilee, they occur sometime between noon and 6 o'clock, when the winds have kicked up. But in those days, as well as today, it's very unusual for a storm to arise on the Sea of Galilee at night, after the winds have died down. That's very unusual. And so when Jesus and His disciples set sail that night, there was no storm. They were not expecting a storm. In fact, it appears to have been an ideal night for sailing. And that is the exact term that Luke uses in his gospel to describe what they did that night. Luke says, but as they sailed, he fell asleep, meaning Jesus. Now, this tells us, when he says they sailed, that tells us there was a breeze that night. Because if there had not been a breeze, then the disciples would have had to have rowed the boat to the other side of the Sea of Galilee. But there was a breeze that was perfect for sailing that evening. And so Jesus is asleep in the stern of the boat. The disciples are enjoying a nice, smooth voyage toward the other side of the Sea of Galilee, when all of a sudden, a violent storm comes out of nowhere. Verse 37 says, and a great windstorm arose. Isn't that the way it is in life? You're sailing along smoothly, and things are going fine 1 minute, and then wham, all of a sudden the bottom falls out, and you're caught in a terrible storm. One phone call, one doctor's visit, one bad test result, one medical crisis, one moment of distraction on the highway, one fall, one stroke, one heart attack, and your whole world can get turned upside down. And I think a lot of times we as Christians tell ourselves that as long as I'm doing God's will, as long as I'm in church every Sunday and I'm reading my Bible and praying like I should, God's not going to let anything bad happen to me. Let me remind you, the apostles were doing the Lord's will when this great storm came up that night. It was the Lord's will to go to the other side of the sea. His disciples were taking Him where He willed to go. They were doing the Lord's will. And yet they found themselves in the midst of a terrible storm. Listen carefully. Just because we do God's will does not make us immune to life storms. Job was the most righteous man in the world in his day and time, and yet look at the horrific storm that man went through. Paul was preaching the gospel, and winning souls to Christ, and establishing new churches, and writing New Testament books, and yet he went through the storm of imprisonment, and stonings, and beatings, and shipwreck. You see, if it were not for life storms, how else would we learn to trust and depend upon the Lord? If it were not for life storms, how else would our faith grow? So the storm came suddenly, out of nowhere. Well, having considered the suddenness of the storm, secondly, let's consider the strength of the storm. Look at verse 37 again. It says, and a great windstorm arose, and waves beat into the boat so that it was already filling. Now, we know that 4 of Jesus' disciples, and possibly as many as 7 of them, had made their living as professional fishermen before they became disciples of Jesus. And having grown up around the Sea of Galilee, these men were very familiar with storms. They had fished these waters for years. They knew the Sea of Galilee like they knew the back of their own hand. They were experienced sailors, and likely they had been caught in a number of storms over the years out on the sea. But this storm was different. This storm was over the top. This storm was unlike anything they had ever seen and been in before. All of their skill, all of their experience, and all of their knowledge as fishermen was absolutely useless in this storm. This storm is God-ordained. This storm is intended to teach the disciples a valuable lesson about putting complete faith and trust in the Lord and not trusting in themselves. In the original Greek language, the wording that is used to describe this storm is the word seismos megos. Seismos megos. When you hear that word seismos, that is the term that we get our English word earthquake from. And you hear the word megos, megos simply means enormously big. And so this was an enormously big windstorm. We're talking about a storm that was so powerful, so severe, so dangerous, it was literally causing the Sea of Galilee to quake. Think of hard boiling water on the stove. That's what the sea was doing that night. It was literally boiling. It was quaking because the storm was so intense. And so picture this scene in your mind. It's pitch dark. Hurricane force winds of 70 plus miles an hour are blowing. Waves 15 to 20 feet in height are crashing over the bow of the boat. The boat is filling up with water. The disciples are bailing water just as quickly as they can, and as soon as they throw out one bucket, it fills right back up. They can't see where they are, and they can't see where they're going. There is nothing humanly possible that the disciples can do. They are caught in a situation that is totally out of their control, and they literally fear for their lives. Life is like that. Life is like that. Sometimes the Lord permits you and me to face a storm that is so powerful, so severe, and so intense that it brings us to the end of ourselves. Sometimes, like the waves that night, we have one trial after another come crashing in on our lives, and we're bailing just as fast as we can to get through one trial when another trial comes along. And sometimes God allows us to go through a storm that is completely out of our control. A trial that is so severe that it takes us beyond the realm of our human experience and our human strength and our human wisdom and our human skill. Sometimes in order to break us of our pride and our independence and our self-sufficiency, God will allow us to go through a storm that is so severe that we have no answers, no solutions, and no fixes. And it makes us fall to our knees and cry out, Lord, help me. Lord, save me. I'm perishing. Some of you here this morning have been through such severe life storms that came up suddenly and unexpectedly, and it literally shook you to the core of your being. Some of you have been through some storms like that. And for those of you who have never experienced such a severe storm as that, trust me, someday you will. It may not be today, it may not be tomorrow, or next week, or next year. But someday every one of us will go through a severe storm that will be so powerful it will bring us to the end of ourselves, and we will have nowhere to turn but to God. Well, we looked at the suddenness of the storm, and we looked at the strength of the storm. Finally, let's consider the supernatural stilling of the storm. Let's pick up the record again, verse 38 through verse 41. But he was in the stern, asleep on a pillow. And they awoke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we're perishing? Then he arose and rebuked the wind and said to the sea, Peace, be still. And the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. But he said to them, Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith? And they feared exceedingly and said to one another, Who can this be, that even the wind and the sea obey him? Do you grasp what's going on here? The disciples are caught in the midst of a storm. It's worse than anything they've ever seen before. Gale force winds are howling. Waves are crashing over the bow of the boat. And the boat is filling up with water. And Jesus is in the stern, asleep on a pillow. That reveals so much about the human and divine nature of Jesus. Humanly speaking, it tells us that Jesus is so tired, so exhausted, so weary after a long, hard day, that he is able to sleep like a baby in the stern of the boat. In other words, as a man, Jesus got tired like we do. But from a divine standpoint, this tells us Jesus has no fear of the storm. He created the wind. He created the waves. He created the Sea of Galilee. He created the wood that was used to make the boat that he was sleeping in. And despite the fact that this storm had Jesus' disciples fearing for their very lives, Jesus has no fear of the storm. Jesus sleeps through the storm. Now it's interesting when you compare the various ways the disciples cried out to Jesus that night. Matthew's gospel says, Then his disciples came to him and awoke him, saying, Lord, save us, we are perishing. Luke's gospel says they came to him and awoke him, saying, Master, Master, we are perishing. And then Mark tells us here in our text, and they awoke him and said to him, Teacher, do you not care that we are perishing? Lord, Master, Teacher, this is the cry of desperation. This is not a rehearsed prayer. This is not a written out prayer. They are praying out of the desperation of their souls. Lord, Master, Master, Teacher. They're just saying anything. They're calling Jesus by any of his titles just to get his attention. The disciples are fully aware that the only one who can save them is Jesus. And if he doesn't do it, they're going to perish. Have you ever prayed a prayer of desperation like that? Have you ever been in a situation that was so hopeless you knew that if the Lord himself did not do something, you weren't going to make it? No prayer is more beautiful to the Lord than the prayer of complete and total surrender. Jesus hears their cries. gets up, and he simply says, "Peace, be still." 3 little words. Peace, be still. And immediately the wind ceased, and there was a great calm. The Greek term for great calm that Mark uses here literally means the greatest calm. In other words, the very moment Jesus spoke those words, "Peace, be still," the gale-force winds ceased immediately. And the waves completely flattened out as though the Sea of Galilee was a big pond. Now, I want you to think about that. After a hurricane goes through here, the waves don't die down immediately, do they? The waves are rough. The sea is churned up for several days after a big storm goes through. But when Jesus said, "Peace, be still," the greatest calm fell over the sea. One minute the boat is being tossed around like a child's toy, and in an instant the boat is sitting in dead water. And Jesus asked them, "Why are you so fearful? How is it that you have no faith?" Now, you would think at that moment the disciples' faith would be soaring to new heights after what they'd just seen. You would think they would say to Jesus, "We will never ever be fearful again, Lord. We now have complete faith and total trust in you, Lord." But that wasn't how they responded. Look at their reaction in verse 41. It said, "And they feared exceedingly, and said to one another, 'Who can this be, that even the wind and the sea obey him?'" Now, what kind of response is that? It's the response of men who are completely overwhelmed by the sense of awe and reverence for the greatness of Jesus. A few moments earlier, they feared the storm. Now think about this. A few moments earlier, they feared the storm. Now, they have an even greater fear for Jesus. Realizing that the one who can speak to the wind and to the waves and make them obey him is in the boat with them. Here's the point. When you fear the Lord, there's no need to fear the storm. You know, in many ways, this account of Jesus calming the storm is like a parable of the Christian life itself. Think of the Christian life as a voyage to the other side, the heavenly shore. And Jesus is in the boat with us throughout the whole journey. And as we make our voyage to heaven, we will encounter many storms along the way. Some of them severe, some of them life-threatening. And yet it is in the midst of life's storms that our faith will be greatly tested. It is in the midst of those storms that Jesus wants us to have complete faith and complete trust in Him. Listen carefully. Jesus is greater, He is stronger, He is more powerful, and He is mightier than any storm that you and I will ever go through. When you have no answers, Jesus is your answer. When you have no solution, Jesus is your solution. When you have no hope, Jesus is your hope. When you are helpless, Jesus is your help. He's your rock. He's your defender. He's your protector. He's your shield. He is your shelter in the time of storm. It has been said the Lord never promised us an easy voyage, but He does promise us a safe landing. And when the storms of life come, don't ever forget that the one who is in the boat with you is is greater than the storm around you. And all of God's people say. We're going to sing our hymn of invitation this morning. I pray that the Lord has used this message to encourage us and strengthen us and to comfort us, because we all go through tough times. All of us do. And sometimes we just need to be reminded of just how great and wonderful our Lord is. Amen? Amen. Let's be